Hey everyone, welcome to a vlog with a difference. I'm sat here in St James's Square in central London, which is just a stone's throw away from the Waterstones shop on Piccadilly. And the reason why I'm here is because it felt entirely appropriate to be sat under this rather lovely tree to talk to you about this book, which is The Overstory by Richard Powers. Now, eagle-eyed viewers, regular viewers, may remember that I mentioned this book at the very beginning of the year as one of the books that I was looking forward to reading this year. And that's because I've read quite a few books by Richard Powers over the years. I started with a book called the Goldberg Variations, which is about two scientists who are looking to uncover the structure of DNA, but it's also, of course, about the structure of Bach's Goldberg Variations, and it's also two love stories. So again, we have this sort of structure of DNA. Of course, there's a double helix, and so this gives you a little clue about Richard Powers. He likes to tell human stories, put in a fair amount of science or something interesting like that, and then often the structure of the book itself will be influenced by what is actually inside the book, what the book is about. And The Overstory is no exception. As you can see from the cover here, this is a book about trees. This is why I'm sat here in the park feeling really conspicuous. And the beginning of the book is called Roots, and what we have here is a brilliant way of introducing characters in a story where their lives are going to intersect. Each of them is given their own chapter. It's a bit like reading a short story about each of the characters. So we have 8 short story chapters there at the beginning. That is the Roots section, and then we get Trunk and we see how those lives will start to come together, and then we have the canopy opening out later on in the book. We see how that narrative really unfolds, and then right at the end there's a little section called Seeds. And this is, as I say, brilliant device by Powers, not only to allow the structure of the real subject of the book, which is trees, to determine the structure of the book itself, but it's a very satisfying way of actually dealing with that narrative. You feel like you really know those characters at the beginning, and we'll be introduced to some very diverse people. We have a scientist whose life work is to show how trees actually communicate with each other and work together as a community to help themselves deal with various threats to their survival, which is a very recent discovery by science, and completely fascinating. We have a Vietnam vet who pretty much owes his life to a tree after falling into it. We have a boy whose life has changed forever after falling out of a tree. We have a woman who accidentally electrocutes herself and manages to survive, but when she comes to, she hears voices which tell her to kind of follow a path towards these trees, and that takes it into a life of eco-activism. So we meet a whole group of people who are involved in that. We have a married couple who have this thing of planting trees together, and it's really a portrait of their marriage. And very slowly we will see how these lives begin to intersect and influence a narrative where they work together. And as you can tell, I loved it. There is so much to talk about with this book that I cannot possibly cover in this vlog. I will say that Richard Powers is hopefully coming across to the UK later in the year, and I'm working very hard to see whether I can get a chance to speak to him about this book. He will explain it far better than me. There is plenty of science in there, but there is also fascinating human stories. And the thing I think that is really clever is that the story that's really being told is not the human stories, it is the story of trees. That is the main character of this book. And there is something about that shift in perspective which is actually what trees are all about. To explain, I recently had the great fortune to speak to the physicist Carlo Rovelli, and I mentioned to him this book after we had our interview, and he told me that he sometimes gets very nervous before delivering a big lecture or a talk, and in that circumstance what he will do is he will take himself outside to a very old tree which is near him, and he will take the time to talk to the tree. He's a fascinating guy, Carlo Rovelli. If you haven't seen the interview, a link will have appeared hopefully up here, and you can go and watch it. He's amazing. And there is something about the perspective of talking to something which was here long before you were here and will be here long after you have gone. That kind of time perspective has a very calming effect in his case. And I think the big thing with this book is to show that the main character is not so much the humans and showing how humans affect trees, it's really showing how trees affect humans and how important they are, not just to our ecosystem, but to our understanding of how nature works, and how important it is for us to keep it alive. So as you can see, there is plenty to talk about with this book, lots to unpack. Primarily, it's a great read. It's quite a big book, but I did not feel that it dragged at all. It doesn't feel heavy. It's sort of, as I said, a great beginning where you feel like you really know the characters, and then you've got this lovely intertwining of narratives as you go along, and then you feel that as the canopy begins to expand, you've got this, it's a great rush of that sort of narrative release when you see how intricately he has worked out his structure and the patterns within it. You can always rely on Richard Powers to do that. And in fact, if I haven't mentioned it already, there is a little quote on the front of the book from Margaret Atwood who says it's not possible for Powers to write an uninteresting book. It really isn't, and I would recommend looking at his back catalogue if you haven't already. There are some absolutely brilliant books in there. Music and science tend to combine quite often. The Time of Our Singing and Orfeo are two other novels of his, which are both sort of big, grand, epic and fantastic. So there we go. Before I get taken away by park police or stared at too much more, I will bid you adieu. Thank you so much for joining me this week. I'll be back in a few weeks' time to tell you about another book, but until then, take care.